Okay, we're about to start. Good evening. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Are you with me? I get more strident as we go on. It's not coming through? How's that now? Better in the back, in the peanut gallery? Wonderful. Well, good evening, as I said. My name is Lizette Coley, and I'm the Executive Director of Parapsychology Foundation. And on behalf of Mrs. Eileen Coley, the Foundation's President, sitting at the end there, and our Board of Trustees, yes, let's applaud for Mrs. Coley, for sure. And our Board of Trustees, we welcome you here this evening for a very special 50th anniversary edition of our Perspective Lecture Series. We are extremely proud to have as our speaker tonight Dr. Charles T. Tart, who is one of parapsychology's leading figures and one of the founders of the field of transpersonal psychology. He is internationally known for his psychological work on the nature of consciousness, particularly altered states of consciousness, and for his research in parapsychology. A professor emeritus psychology at the University of Davis, California, and a core faculty member of the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology in Palo Alto, California. His three classic books, Altered States of Consciousness, 1969, Transpersonal Psychologies, I believe in 75, and again in 75, States of Consciousness, are widely used texts that have been instrumental in allowing these areas to become part of modern psychology. His most recent book, Mind Science, Meditation Training for Practical People, I can personally attest is of great value and help to me as I seek to administer the works of Parapsychology Foundation. Now, it is extremely apropos that Dr. Tart is delivering this lecture at this momentous time in Parapsychology Foundation's history. He has long been a colleague and a great friend to Parapsychology Foundation since the year 1957, when he received his first grant for, I believe, $100 to study ESP projections, traveling clairvoyance, as stated on his grant form. On April 26, 1957, Dr. Tart wrote Eileen J. Garrett, our founder and first Parapsychology Foundation president, and I quote, "I have long felt that psychical research can ultimately find the facts which will make a dynamic faith in God and man possible for the Western world, and I hope to be able to do my little bit toward achieving this goal. Let me again express my appreciation for your aid in helping me to move a little closer toward this goal through the experience of my experiment." That's the end of that quote. Well, first, may I state that, as I'm sure we'll all agree, that Charlie has done more than his little bit for achieving his stated goal. And Parapsychology Foundation is justifiably extremely proud of his part in assisting his in assisting his researches in parapsychology. Through the years, he's been a participant in several PF international conferences, written one of our scholarly monographs entitled The Application of Learning Theory to ESP Performance, which you'll forgive me is still available for sale, may I add, and authored articles, and has always stood available with good counsel whenever he was called upon by Eileen Coley and myself. Now, as an example of the measure of the man who remembers his first grant all those years ago, Parapsychology Foundation is proud to today announce the creation of the Charles T. Tart and Judith A. Tart Student Incentive Award for Parapsychological Research. Through the generosity of Dr. and Mrs. Tart, this annual award of $500 will be given to a student who demonstrates a strong commitment to work within parapsychology. At this time, then, with great personal and professional pleasure, I give you Dr. Tart speaking to God and nothing but the brain, taking spirits seriously. Dr. Tart.
It's always really funny to sit through an introduction like that, especially when I'm back on the East Coast and I remember that I'm just a kid from Trenton, actually, and don't have my California cover with me. But, okay, I'm guilty. I'm really happy to be here speaking for the 50th anniversary of the Parapsychology Foundation, because as I was working on what I wanted to say, I realized that it's kind of my 50th anniversary in parapsychology. It was just about 50 years ago that I was reading voraciously in the old literature of psychical research and the then current literature of parapsychology. Litter of parapsychology. What an interesting slip. Well, there are some problems with the field, but we won't get into that. And then it was only a few years later that I actually carried out my first experiment, supported by a grant from the Parapsychology Foundation, which got me going on that particular thing. I tried also to become respectable and work in areas like altered states of consciousness, which weren't respectable then, but they've sort of become respectable, so it's worked out all right. I want to cover a lot of ground tonight to make some important points, so I may have to cover it lightly, but I will be happy to leave time for questions afterwards. My topic is God and Nothing But the Brain, scientific evidence for taking spirit seriously. I noticed you slipped and said spirits, Lisette. That was very interesting. A family tradition, that's okay. Instead of explaining it all the way. Can I have the first slide, please, Carlos? Ah, yes, that's my focus slide, actually. It does a job of focusing, and if it were real, you'd be told what you're supposed to see on that. But it's not real, so you don't have to see anything in particular. So we'll go to the actual second transparency. I imagine most of you saw this Newsweek cover and probably read the article in it, God and the Brain. And you might say that spirit, God, religion is in the news, and its relation to science is very much a topic that's in the news. But I have to say, from my perspective, it's sort of always in the news. It wanes and waxes depending on which particular year, but every few years there is some big articles about God and the brain, usually explaining God away. But the one lesson we can learn from that as a start is that the topic's important to us. Somehow, spirituality has not just gone away as science has progressed on. It's stayed with us from somehow. I want to talk about it by starting from taking the perspective of happiness. Can I have the next slide, please, Carlos? Am I respectable enough to take my jacket off now? It's hot up here. So thank you.
No.
Here's someone that I think is probably one of the most widely identified people in the world as being someone spiritual.
Sorry. That was better. Thank you.
Do I sound any better?
Yeah.
Okay, whatever, all right. This is His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and if he isn't a spiritual person, I don't know who is. And a friend of mine who went to some teachings of his put down in her notes that the Dalai Lama was saying that the purpose of human life is to attain happiness. We all strive to achieve happiness and work to avoid suffering. I haven't met too many people who will quarrel with that as a goal for life, except people who are very, very righteous, but we'll skip that one. And the Dalai Lama also says, why do we participate in spiritual practice? For happiness. There's no other reason. We may give many lofty reasons for wanting to be involved in some kind of spiritual path, but basically we'd like to be happy. So what makes us happy? On a very basic level, I can think of three things that make us happy. One is getting what we want, and the second one obviously is not getting what we don't want. But there's a third psychological level of happiness that's very important, and that's finding meaning in life. If life seems meaningless, it's very depressing, it causes anxiety, it causes us to do all sorts of crazy things. And speaking as a psychologist, I'd say we need meaning just as much as we need vitamins, carbohydrates, basic nutritional things. And if we don't get enough meaning, we suffer deficiency diseases the same way we'd suffer physical deficiency diseases like scurvy if we didn't get enough vitamin C. So I want to focus on meaning as a central issue, that we need to understand that we suffer if we don't, and when we suffer from not having meaning, we bring others along with us by making them suffer also. A key belief in finding meaning in life is in what's the nature of consciousness? What is your mind? Is it an accidental collection of biological processes that happens to think? Or does it have some deeper meaning, the kind of thing we call spiritual? Can I have the next slide, please, Carlos? So, simplified diagram I came up with some years ago to try to talk about this. Can you read that from the back? I bet not. Those of you who can't hear me, raise your hands. Okay, you at least hear me. The structure here is talking about our physical brain and nervous system, which obviously has all sorts of interesting parts to it. It's got what you might call biological hardware. It's got mental software that results from the conditioning we get when we're children as we're enculturated and made to be good citizens of our particular culture. But a spiritual view is that something different than just the physical stuff is added to it. Something comes from the outside. I've called it pure awareness here, something of a different nature that then, in its interaction with the brain, constitutes what we call consciousness as we experience it. That's the basic spiritual view, that there's something extra other than sort of just the physical hardware of our existence. Now, I'm saying the word spiritual deliberately, not religion so much. Religion tends to be the results of a multitude of committee decisions about what you're supposed to believe and not believe. And when I say spiritual, I'm referring back to the fact that people have experiences which at a very deep level convince them of this something extra, of this meaning quality of the universe. To give you an example of that, I want to read you a classic example of a spiritual experience, one that was termed by the man who experienced it, R.M. Buck, cosmic consciousness. This happened at the turn, I was going to say the turn of the last century, but I guess it was the turn of the last century, late 1800s. He says it was in the early spring at the beginning of his 36th year. He's writing about himself in the third person to try to be more objective about it. He was a doctor by training. He and two friends had spent the evening reading Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats, Browning, and especially Whitman. They parted at midnight, and he had a long drive in a hansom cab. His mind, deeply under the influences of the ideas, images, and emotions called up by the reading and talk of the evening, was calm and peaceful. He was in a state of quiet, almost passive enjoyment. All at once, without warning of any kind, he found himself wrapped around, as it were, by a flame-colored cloud. For an instant he thought of fire, some sudden conflagration in the great city. The next he knew that the light was within himself. Directly afterwards came upon him a sense of exultation, of immense joyousness, accompanied or immediately followed by an intellectual illumination quite impossible to describe. Into his brain streamed one momentary lightning flash of the Brahmic splendor, which has since lightened his life. Upon his heart fell one drop of Brahmic bliss, leaving thenceforward for always an aftertaste of heaven. Among other things, he did not come to believe, but he saw and knew that the cosmos is not dead matter, but a living presence, that the soul of man is immortal, that the universe is so built and ordered that without any peradventure, all things work together for the good of each and all, and that the foundation principle of the world is what we call love, and that the happiness of everyone is in the long run absolutely certain. He claims that he learned more in those few seconds than in previous years of study, and he learned much that no study could ever have taught. He had no doubt ever afterwards of the truth of what went into his mind. Now, can we have the next slide, please, Carlos? This is not the dominant view nowadays. The dominant view, this is kind of like the diagram I showed you before. We've still got all this biological, neurological structure here, but now as a result of that structure, something arises called consciousness or awareness. That is, the dominant materialistic view is that consciousness is a product of the brain. It's now seen as some kind of emergent property of the computing action of the brain. When people thought more of the brain in terms of chemistry, they talked about the brain secreting consciousness like the liver secretes bile. And it says basically consciousness is not of a different order than your ordinary material neurological activities. The next slide, please, shows you one of the diagrams from the Newsweek article. This diagram makes me kind of believe in reincarnation because it keeps coming back in varying forms all the time. Every few years you get another diagram of which part of the brain produces spiritual experiences, but since it's nothing but a brain production, of course it's an illusion. Note the labeling bias on this. For instance, Newsweek said, "This is your brain on God." Well, we usually use that phrase for drug-induced hallucinations. Simple labeling tells you something about that. The dominant materialistic view, which most people think is the scientific view, I'll get to that in a moment, is that consciousness is generated by the brain. It, of course, undergoes changes when the brain malfunctions, as in disease or injury, and when the brain dies, when the body dies, that's the end of consciousness. Zero, kaput, nada. Spiritual experiences from this point of view are nonsense. They are hallucinations. Buck was a nice doctor who obviously had some kind of epileptic storm in his brain that got him kind of confused about the way reality is, and apparently it was a permanent damage since he said he stuck with the experience afterwards. From the materialistic view, a spiritual experience has the same truth value as if your computer suddenly started printing out, "I have interfaced with the great computer in the sky and now experience electro-ecstasy and all binary knowledge." You'd call the repairman. What we tend to think nowadays, by being products of Western culture, is that this second view of the nature of consciousness, that it's nothing but something the brain puts out, is that this has been scientifically proven, that this is a fact. We forget that it's a hypothesis, it's a philosophical view, it's one way of thinking about some data, and take it as a fact. From that perspective, the Dalai Lama may be a nice man, but he's a profoundly deluded man. He believes in nonsense, basically, and how much can you expect to get out of life if your whole view of the nature of reality is nonsensical? And of course, if the Dalai Lama might be a nice man, but is basically deluded, any of you who take your spirituality seriously must be deluded too. Isn't that scientific fact? I'm going to try to tell you that it's not. And one of the reasons I find it important to tell people that is that I've talked to innumerable people who have suffered a lot in life because they've had profound spiritual experiences which they were then convinced meant there's something wrong with them, and that that's some kind of scientific truth. That's not scientific truth. Let's look at I said happiness is a key issue here. Let's look at this view that the mind is nothing but the brain, that spirituality is just some kind of illusion for a moment. Simply from the psychological point of view, what does it do to your happiness if you think your mind is nothing but the brain and dies with the brain and that spirituality is a delusion? Years ago, to try to make people realize how powerful cultural conditioning was on us, I came up with an experiential exercise to let people see what some of our conditioning is. Now, I'm not actually going to do the exercise with you tonight. I'm just going to describe it, because when I do the exercise, I then have to spend a considerable period of time afterwards helping people deal with the after effects. Because too many people who think they are spiritual people, not derailed by science, find that part of them believes a very depressing view of life, and they're kind of shocked to believe that. I came up with a belief exercise for people to do. I would have these people agree that just for the sake of an experiment, for 15 minutes they would believe some stuff I would tell them. In the sense that you play a game, you know, everybody's played Monopoly, right? Totally artificial, but while you believe it, you take it seriously, and you feel upset when you land on Boardwalk with 2 hotels on it and have to pay all that rent and whatnot. So I ask people to play this game in that same sort of belief thing. And then just to make use of people's social conditioning, I have them all stand in orderly rows with their hand on their hearts as if they're pledging allegiance to the flag, and get them to repeat after me something I call the Western Creed. I have taken what people popularly think is the scientific truth about the universe and expressed it in a form directly parallel to the Apostolic Creed in Christianity. Okay, I'm not attacking Christianity in this. This is an exercise to teach people something, okay? I have them get up and say, I believe in the material universe as the only and ultimate reality. A universe controlled by fixed physical laws and blind chance. If you want to observe your reactions while you do this, you may learn something, but we're not doing the whole thing. Okay? I affirm that the universe has no creator, no objective purpose, and no objective meaning or destiny. I maintain that all ideas about God or gods or other non-physical beings or forces are superstitions and delusions. Life and consciousness are totally identical to physical processes and arose from chance interactions of blind physical forces. Like the rest of life, and my consciousness have no objective purpose, meaning, or destiny. I believe that all judgments, values, and moralities, whether my own or others, are subjective, arising solely from biological determinants, personal history, and chance. Free will is an illusion. Therefore, the most rational values I can personally live by must be based on the knowledge that for me, what pleases me is good, what pains me is bad. Those who please me or help me avoid pain are my friends. Those who pain me or keep me from my pleasure are my enemies. Rationality requires that friends and enemies be used in ways that maximize my pleasure and minimize my pain. I affirm that churches have no real use other than social support. There are no objective sins to commit or be forgiven for. Virtue for me is getting what I want without being caught or inhibited by others. And of course, I maintain that the death of the body is the death of the mind, and any hope of an afterlife is nonsense. Now, I suspect a number of you feel bad just listening to that. When people actually do it in the belief thing, as I say, even people who think of themselves as deeply committed spiritual seekers discover that lots of them believes lots of that, and it's very depressing. And they think that's scientific fact. That's the gospel of physical materialism. Now recall that I said we were going to look at this first from the viewpoint of happiness. This does not make too many people happy. It makes a small minority of people happy. But looking back at, I think these are people whose exposure to religion was basically, you're a sinner and you're going to hell and there's nothing you can do about it. Then the thought of a meaningless universe where death is the end is kind of a relief. But special circumstances. Now, psychologically, I don't like materialism as a philosophy of life because it makes people unhappy. It takes the meaning out of things. But being committed to science, I can't say I won't believe it just because I don't like it. I believe in real science as an excellent way of getting information about the truth of things. So I've talked about the problem we're in, a major obstacle to happiness, that because our spirituality is so undercut. Now let me talk about the reason I think it doesn't have to be this way. First, I want to define what real science is. Can I have the next slide, please, Carlos? Most people think science is a philosophy that only what is physical, only what is material is real. And this gave us a Newtonian universe, a billiard ball universe. Basically, things are lumps of matter that stay there until something hits them and bounces them off something else. And when you translate that into biology, basically you're a chemical package with some genes that build your nervous system in a certain way. And when the right stimuli come in and bounce you in a certain direction, you bounce off other people, and that's the end of the story. It objectifies us in a very real sense. And I know some of you are going to say, but what about quantum physics? Quantum physics is very mysterious and interesting, but it's still basically reductionistic in its outlook here. It's this reductive materialism, saying only what's material is real, that has taken the view that consciousness is nothing but the brain, that reduces spirituality to an electrochemical storm in the brain that doesn't reflect reality very well. Spirit, by implying something non-material, something outside the skull, must be unscientific, so that even looking for evidence for spirituality must mean you're stupid? No. It's really important to distinguish science from scientism. Could I have the next slide, please, Carlos? Modern science arose out of two major factors. One was just plain curiosity. How does the world work? What's reality like? The other was a rebellion against the authority of a church that said, if you want to know what reality is, read it in the approved books by the approved authorities. Don't go out and look. Read it in Aquinas, what have you. The early scientists basically said, can I please go out and look? Okay, I guess it was Aristotle, I think, who said, heavier objects fall faster than lighter objects. If you want to know about falling objects, that was the answer. Some people said, couldn't I go out and drop some and look? Turns out that once you take account of air resistance, objects fall at the same rate. Doesn't matter how much they weigh. Science is a process that said its primary way of learning about the world is to observe, to look at what's out there. Scientism, which is a mental hardening of the arteries coupled with a lot of arrogance, said the only thing you're allowed to look at is what's physical. I think that's silly. I look at my own mind every day and observe all sorts of interesting things. True science doesn't have to limit itself to looking only at physical objects. Science also said try to do a better job of it. So maybe if you want to understand the way your mind works and you find one of the things about your mind is that it's very busy, so it's kind of hard to keep track of what's going on, maybe there is a technique you could invent. Let's make up a name for it, like meditation maybe, that would quiet your mind, and then you could get a look at what's going on because it's not happening so fast. Science then recognizes that we're all meaning junkies. Nobody's happy with just the facts. If I told you there are 142 people on the sidewalk outside right now and that's a fact, so what? We always want to know what things mean. So science says, right, get your facts first, and then you can think of what they mean and try to think logically about it. But then once you've thought about what it means, don't stop there just because you like your thinking. This is important because whenever we have a thought that pleases us, we get real happy. Aren't I smart? Science says make some predictions from your theory and go out and look at the real world again. Go out and look at the data and see if things really work. And you keep refining your thoughts about the way the world is by constantly coming back to what is. Okay, scientism happens when some of the theories are so neat, so good, that basically you start thinking, we got it all figured out. And you get arrogant. And then somebody comes along and says, but I have some facts that don't fit. There's something wrong with that person. They can't have facts that don't fit because you know the truth. That's scientism. Scientism is started with scientific method, coupled it to a philosophy of materialism, a belief that everything must be reduced to nothing but a physical explanation, and then became arrogant in that belief. Because what we're going to get down to tonight is that there are a lot of facts, there are a lot of things you can actually observe as happening in reality that contradict the view that the mind is nothing but the brain and so the spiritual is inherently nonsense. Now, understand, I'm not claiming that science is the only way you can learn anything useful in life. When I go off on a meditation retreat, the instructors very seldom say anything at all about science. But science is awfully useful. So, I'm going to try to very briefly summarize over 40 years of personal professional activity in parapsychology and 50 years of interest in it, and what amounts to more than 100 years of research, since this was happening long before me, that lets us rationally reject scientism, that lets us rationally say, I'm interested in spiritual things, and that doesn't necessarily mean I'm a kook. I mean, you may be a kook, I don't know. But it doesn't necessarily mean I'm a kook just because I'm interested in spiritual things, because there is solid scientific evidence to take that stuff seriously. Not that we have all the answers, but to take it seriously and learn more about it. The next slide shows a couple of pioneers of modern parapsychology. All of you would recognize J.B. Rhine and his wife Louisa Rhine. He tended to study all the laboratory manifestations of psychic phenomena. His wife tended to study the spontaneous things that happen in everyday life. It was a nice kind of balance, kept the two connected. Now, parapsychology is probably the most rigorous branch of science around. You won't hear that many places. You'll say people who are advocates of scientism either never heard of parapsychology or say, oh, that's some sort of sloppy thing, and since they seem to get results that don't fit our complete understanding of reality, they must be doing something wrong. If you actually look at the methods, parapsychology is done to much higher standards than practically all science. A recent study, for instance, looked at how often is the double-blind method. This is the gold standard in medical research. We know that people can be biased. If somebody thinks they're getting a certain medicine, they can have a reaction on that expectation alone. If an experimenter giving a certain medicine to a person knows what he's giving them and knows now I'm giving the placebo, something, you can get effects that just come from that kind of bias alone. So the double-blind is the best kind of experimental design we have. Neither the subject nor the experimenter knows what they're getting. Well, a study was done of many science journals, okay, in a variety of fields. The so-called hard sciences, which I actually think are the easy sciences because it doesn't matter what mood you're in, like physics, chemistry, and all that, they apparently never heard of the double-blind method. They are all objective scientists simply seeing the truth. He couldn't find the method mentioned in surveying journal articles in those fields. When he got down to psychology and medicine, he found maybe 10% of the studies that supposedly create the real knowledge base of these disciplines use the double-blind method. In parapsychology, 85% of the studies use the double-blind method. The methodology really is good. I'm quite proud of my colleagues in parapsychology and my own parapsychological research, because when we're doing the science part of it, we do it well. So that's why I'm saying we have a very rational basis for rejecting pure materialists. Can I have the next slide, please? There have been a number of phenomena studied at length in the laboratory. By at length, I mean for all of these things, there's more than, as a rough guess, 2,000 published experiments. I say a rough guess because I gave up counting a long time ago. It's very boring to just keep counting. That's a lot of experiments. Not that the field is that big, but it's been going on for a long time and these things add up. Collectively, several phenomena have been well established beyond what I think is any reasonable doubt that are collectively called psi, with the Greek letter psi. I'm spelling that out explicitly because years ago I acquired bad semantic karma. I published a book that I thought was called Psi, Scientific Studies of the Psychic Realm, but the publisher set Psi all in caps, as big PSI, and ever since then people have come up to tell me about their PSI experiences. So I'm still suffering for that particular sense. So it's Psi, the Greek letter, okay? We've all heard terms for them: telepathy, mind-to-mind communication; clairvoyance, direct knowledge of the state of the physical world; precognition, knowing about what's happening in advance when it can't be rationally predicted. Collectively, those are often called, those three forms, extrasensory perception; and psychokinesis, the direct influence of mind on matter. I'll talk about each of these more specifically. Those are what I used to call the Big Four. The Big Four in the sense that they all had hundreds of experiments behind them saying something's happening here. I now usually talk about the Big Five because there's been a lot of research on psychic healing that show that there's definitely effects on people in biological systems. Maybe it's a subcategory of PK, maybe it's something different. We've basically got 5 of them that are really solidly established now. All of these are established by basically doing an experiment where you take what we know about the physical world, assume that's enough, and then set up an impossible situation. Okay, we know about sound, for instance. We know that the intensity of sound decreases not only with distance, but with the square of the distance. So if I shout here, I can certainly be heard in the room, but I probably can't be heard on the first floor of the hotel. Too much distance, too many barriers in between. So we set up a situation where nothing can happen. And then we see if something does happen when we ask people to try to get information from one place to another. And then we try to objectively evaluate what's going on. And this is an important step that is really established as firmly as a science. Could I have the next slide, please, Carlos? I'll have to read this to you since I know you can't see it in the back. You could make it go more toward the top, Carlos. That might happen. This is a Dilbert cartoon about Ken the Skeptic. Okay? And there's Ken the Skeptic holding up an envelope saying, "I alone know the contents of this envelope." And is that Ratbert? Is that what you call him? The little critter there? Okay. So Ratbert does his little psychic thing and he says, "It's a charcoal drawing of a woodchuck eating a small orange." And Ken the Skeptic says, "Nice try, you little fraud, but that's a long way from an ink drawing of a beaver eating a tangerine." It gets that bad sometimes, actually. But the point is, you don't want to make subjective judgments about whether you've really got some kind of psi happening, whether you've really got some kind of extrasensory perception happening. You want to have some more objective way of doing it. The next slide shows you the one that's been most widely used in the classical era of parapsychology, and these are the so-called Zener cards or Rhine cards, where basically you had a card deck of 5 of each of these 5 different symbols, and you know what chance is. By guessing alone, you're going to get 5 of these on the average. Sometimes a little more, sometimes a little less, but the more you do, the more it's going to average out to be about 5. You can count up how many things people get. So for telepathy, you'd obviously have someone looking at a randomized deck of cards in one room, someone else who's sensorially shielded from them guessing at them. But I decided that since this is kind of my 50th anniversary too, when I can, rather than describing each of these phenomena mainly in terms of sort of the bulk of the evidence, I'm going to talk about research I've done on the particular phenomena, particularly because in most cases the Parapsychology Foundation helps support me in doing the research, so it ties in a little bit more. So I'm sharing the blame, Lisette. Okay? So for telepathy, for instance, if I could have the next slide, please. This is some telepathy experiments I did years ago when I was at the University of California at Davis, and I still very much respected the card guessing tradition, because this is basically a response board that's got the cards 1 to 10 pasted around it, and there's a light beside each card and a button beside each card. And then a little signal light in the middle that's glowing, and when that signal light comes on, that basically says to the person trying to be a telepathic receiver that a sender in another room, I have the next slide please, which happens to be yours truly in this case, sorry about that, has used a random generator to pick one of those cards, light the light beside it, and is then attempting to send that information to the receiver who's in a distant room with several closed doors in between. This was a fun telepathy test. It was particularly fun because you notice the TV set sitting up on top of the apparatus? We decided it'd be nice to give the sender some feedback on whether the sender's being successful or not by having a camera watching where the receiver is putting their hand. Are they getting hot or cold? Are they over the right thing or have they moved away with it? In fact, this led to some of the most fun and frustrating aspects of this entire experiment, because there were times when the senders got really angry at the receivers, because it was perfectly obvious from the receiver's hand behavior that they knew what the right one was. As soon as the ready light went on, their hand went right out over the right one. They went away, they came back. They went away, they came back. They went away, they came back. They went away, they came back, and suddenly pushed the wrong button. You know, and they all had fantasies then of where's the electric shock button. Okay, I did this for I wasn't trying to prove telepathy particularly. I had some ideas about trying to train people, but this is an example of how you can do a telepathy experiment, and there are hundreds of telepathy experiments involving various kinds of modes, lots of them with straight card things, some of them involving pictures as target material, where we do have a more objective way of evaluating it than using Ken the Skeptic. I'll talk about that in a minute. And that's the kind of thing that to me has shown incontrovertible proof of telepathy. And also it's made it clear that telepathy is not something that can reduce to mind equals brain, because the data we have about telepathy, and about all kinds of psi for that matter, simply don't follow the kind of physical laws that would happen if it was a function of the brain. So for instance, any kind of physical system that we know of that sends signals has a problem of falling off with distance. There's no evidence that ESP performance falls off with distance in any way. The only exception in a physical system is something that is incredibly focused like a laser beam, but there have been successful telepathy tests hundreds of miles apart. Okay, if you've got your tight beam, how do you aim it exactly right? It just doesn't show any of the qualities that we associate with the physical system. Second major basic phenomenon is clairvoyance, the direct perception of aspects of the physical world that are not in the sender's mind. Often there is no sender. When it was done with card guessing tests, basically an experimenter shuffled a deck of cards face down, often left it in the box, told somebody write down the order of the deck of cards. No point using telepathy, because at the time the receiver is trying to get something, nobody has any idea what the order of the deck of cards is. I'm going to show you a much more interesting modern version of clairvoyance, although it may have some elements of telepathy mixed with it sometimes, that I think is a lot more fun, and that's something called remote viewing. Could I have the next slide, please, Carlos? Remote viewing became quite popular or well known a few years ago, especially when it was discovered that the CIA and other military agencies funded a lot of it. And despite all the political backing away, we couldn't do anything like that. It was damn useful for intelligence purposes. I was a consultant on the projects, and I can't say anything more specific than that because I had to sign too many pieces of paper that kept ending up with 10 years in jail and $10,000 fine, except for the cheap one that was only 5 years in jail and a $5,000 fine. But there is a book called Remote Viewers, actually, which got a lot of stuff under the Freedom of Information Act. And the remote viewing thing, you started out with 3 people. A target picker who basically selected a lot of possible places that a traveler could go to. In the original studies, the rule was it had to be within a half-hour drive of the laboratory, which was Stanford Research Institute. That's in the California Bay Area region. A half-hour drive means you're limited to probably about 10 million possible targets. It's a marvelous system because basically there's so many possible places you could go in that time that your rational mind can give up trying to figure anything out. The possibilities are just too great. Then there are 2 other people, the traveler who's going to go there at a certain time and the viewer who's going to try to describe what the place looks like that the traveler has gone to. Now, at the beginning of the experiment, the traveler and the viewer can get acquainted with each other, establish some rapport, become friends, because the traveler can't give anything away. The traveler at this point has no idea where he or she is supposed to be going after a while. But that period ends, the traveler goes and gets some instructions from the target picker who randomly picks a target out of this pool. The traveler receives the travel instructions, doesn't open them yet, they're in a sealed envelope. The viewer, meantime, goes into isolation with a laboratory-bound experimenter, and I show these big X's to indicate they're isolated from each other now. The traveler goes out to his car, opens the envelope, see where he's supposed to be in half an hour, goes there. At the end, and does what's appropriate at the target. If the target turned out to be a McDonald's, for instance, the traveler would buy and eat a hamburger. If it was a church, he'd pray for the success of the experiment. A playground, play on the swings, whatever. You do what people normally do at a place like that. At the appropriate time, the lab-bound experimenter asks the remote viewer to close their eyes, try to get impressions of what the target is like that the traveler is at, not particularly to see it through the traveler's eyes, but to describe the site. That's actually an important part of the design, although I won't go into the reason at the moment. All these things are recorded, the verbal descriptions recorded, any drawings are copied, and so forth. The experiment's over, the traveler returns to the lab, the viewer meets the traveler, together they go out to the target site so they can get some relatively quick feedback on how did I do. Does my description seem to have anything to do with the target or does it not? Now, to evaluate this, again, to avoid the Ken the skeptic problem, you have to have an objective way of evaluation. Otherwise, I'm going to remote view everybody's home right now. There is a feeling of light and blueness above and a solid feeling below. That's right, isn't it? I've described any place on the surface of the earth. You got to get some specificity. Okay, so you always do a series of these things, and then an independent judge is essentially given a whole list of, here's a bunch of targets that were used, here's a bunch of descriptions that were generated, they're both in a random order, go to each place, rate each description as to how well does it fit. If you've really got clairvoyance happening, then a description intended for target A will get a high match to target A and not to the other ones, and so forth. If you're getting vague generalities, then everything will match everything else. A lot of experiments were very successful this way. Let me give you an example from one that was successful and evaluated by this blind judging techniques. Could I have the next slide, please? This is from Targ and Putoff's book, Mind Reach, with one of their most successful remote viewers, Pat Price. The upper nice neat diagram is an architect's drawing of what the target site was like, a playground area in Palo Alto. The sketch below is what the remote viewer drew. You can't see it, so stand up for a second and see that they look a lot alike. Okay, and I'll read you the verbal description. Pat's drawing is shown in which he correctly described a park-like area containing 2 pools of water. One he described as rectangular and 60 by 89 feet. Actually, it was 75 by 100 feet. And the other is circular with a diameter of 120 feet, although the actual diameter was 110 feet. He was incorrect, however, in saying that the facility was used for water filtration rather than for swimming. With further experimentation, we began to realize that the occurrence of essentially correct descriptions of basic elements and patterns coupled with incomplete or erroneous analysis of functioning was a continuing thread in the remote viewing work. As can be seen from this drawing, Pat also included some elements such as the tanks shown in the upper right. Can you slide that up a minute? You know, he's got his round pool here and his rectangular pool here, but he drew a couple of water tanks there. There aren't any water tanks there. So he added some stuff that aren't there. And he also had a left-right reversal. He got his round and his rectangular pools reversed compared to the actual thing. That's what's meant by clairvoyance. They don't take the traveler's point of view because that might contain bias, but the judge has to match a description of a place with the actual physical features of that place. Now, the third major form of psi, of ESP, is precognition. I have never deliberately done a precognition experiment because at some level I resist it very strongly. I did not know that I resisted it strongly. I always have intellectually accepted, and the card guessing tests for it are very straightforward. You simply say to someone, now you see this deck of cards? An hour after you leave, I'm going to shuffle it very thoroughly 100 times without looking at it. Would you please write down now what the order of the deck of cards would be? It works. I've always accepted intellectually. You know, nobody's ever gotten 100%, but you get enough right above chance to show that something is happening. So I say I never did a precognition experiment, although in analyzing some telepathy data from my lab, I once found very strong evidence of precognitive missing, scoring way below chance, and I was shocked because it made me realize that I don't have to have resistance against precognition. The idea is so preposterous that there's no need to resist it. But nevertheless, the data shows that this can work. Now, if there's precognition, if the mind can sometimes predict a future that's brought about by random processes, and so can't really be predicted, what about the logical opposite of postcognition? Can the mind pick up things that are in the past? Well, there aren't any formal experiments on this because there's a very methodological problem. The only way you can verify that something actually existed in the past is to have a currently existing record of it. So if someone correctly describes that, how do you know they're just not clairvoyantly looking at the currently existing record? It's all hell to do an experiment around it. But if I could have the next slide, something like 15 or 20 years after the Pat Price remote viewing thing, the city of Palo Alto published its annual report showing a picture of the site where the swimming pool complex was now located. And 50 years before, it was a water filtration plant, and there were 2 towers there full of water. You may not be able to handle it in a nice experimental way, but it certainly is very interesting to think that the mind may be able to reach into the past. Okay, those are all forms of extrasensory perception, those kinds of psi. How about mind over matter? The classic experiment got started when a professional gambler wandered into J.B. Rhine's laboratory at Duke many years ago and said something to the effect of, "Doc, I'm a professional gambler. I shoot craps for a living, and I don't cheat. I've always made a good living at it, but recently I read this book by this statistics professor and found out I can't possibly have been making the living I've been making all these years. What's going on?" Which led to many interesting experiments in dice tossing, leading to some wonderful Rube Goldberg machines, big rotating wire cages with dice falling all over, and suddenly trap doors would fall open and the dice would fall out, while somebody was told, "You stand in the corner and make them come up 5s this time." I haven't done any dice studies, but I did do a fascinating psychokinesis experiment, again sticking with this theme of my own research. The next slide shows you a study I did with a spinning silver coin, a silver dollar. There's something about really spinning a silver dollar and watching it. It's kind of hypnotic. You can get into trying to see the pattern and trying to make it fall over to come up heads or tails. So I invented this wonderful Rube Goldberg apparatus to make sure that nobody was spinning it in some funny kind of way. The silver dollar got put in a little chute here, and when a trigger switch was pressed, it rolled down the chute, hit a little switch, and this bat arm came out and batted the coin, which spun it out onto the table, and it spun for a while. And the table itself very slowly rotated to equalize the wear patterns. It was the best I've ever done in my goal to become a mad scientist in terms of weird apparatus. The next slide shows you an actual picture of it, but I don't think the actual picture is quite as clear as the schematic diagram of it. Oh, and the whole thing was mounted on alternating layers of tires and concrete blocks to shock mount it. Learned that trick from a laser physicist. You can get a wonderful vibration-proof table with several alternate layers of concrete blocks and used tires. And those tires get fantastic mileage on their side like that. And I didn't get a lot of good results out of it, but I got enough to intrigue me. But again, there have been many studies of psychokinesis, and now all the psychokinesis studies are done with electronic random number generators. You sit in front of a black box, basically, that, say, has a red light and a green light, and these things are flashing because there's a random generator that's essentially generating 50% of each of these things in a random way, and each generation flashes the light. Somebody says, okay, for the next minute, make the green light come on more than the red light. Thank you. Now make the red light come on more than the green light. Well, I've always found this wonderfully mind-bending because, if you're trying to influence dice, you can sort of model it in your mind. You can think, well, if I could, that thing's tumbling through the air, and if I can push on it just the right amount at just the right time, I can maybe make it come up to the desired face. What do you push on inside this electronic apparatus? It makes no sense, but it works. People get results with these things. I've said the big fifth of the psi phenomena are healing phenomena. Classic experiment of this was done by Bernard Grad, a biological researcher at Canadian University. For the next slide, this is a diagrammatic representation of wounds that were deliberately induced in mice. Okay? Close your ears if you're squeamish for a moment. The wounds were made by basically holding up the mice, which have very loose skin, and clipping off a piece of skin. And then you can lay a piece of tracing paper over it and trace the outline of the wound and measure it with a planimeter so you know exactly how big the wound is. He set up 3 groups for this. One, the labels don't come through here clearly, but the top was a control group. These were mice who were going to have nothing special done. The second group were going to be treated by a healer who would essentially have the mouse inside a paper bag, and he'd hold the paper bag with the mouse in his hands while giving it a healing treatment. And the third was a control group where they worried that maybe just the heat of the hands had something to do with it. So these were non-healers who held the bags in their hands for the same amount of time for mice in the control group. The non-healers being medical students who are not reputed to have healing abilities. Strange little sociological comment there. The next slide shows you the outcome for these 3 groups. This, I believe, is 14 days later. In the control group, you can see there had been some healing in all of those, but you still had quite a number of fairly big wounds there. The middle group is the ones treated by the healer, Mr. Estebani. You can see there was much more healing there. And in the heat treatment group, the medical students just holding the bags in their hands, essentially the same as the control group. Many variations on this kind of thing, but that's why I say there seems to be some kind of healing psychic ability. Now, all these 5 psi phenomena are incompatible with current reductive materialism. They're not incompatible with what philosophers have called promissory materialism. Promissory materialism is the ultimate out. If something doesn't fit with a physical explanation you like, you say, but someday when they've done more research, they'll prove that it happens physically. The trouble with that kind of statement is you can't possibly refute it. There's no way you can prove that someday they won't prove something according to whatever standards they like. So that's not science, that's scientism when you use this promissory materialism. So up to this point, what I can say to you is reductive materialism, bringing everything down to only what's material and dismissing things that way, is clearly incomplete. You can't say mind equals nothing but brain. that spirit equals nothing but brain, because the mind, the human spirit, can do things that can't be reduced to anything we can reasonably conceptualize as brain functioning at this point, or straightforward projections of our current physical knowledge. We could say then that psi is sort of at least a temporary transcendence of the limitations of your ordinary physical self, and it gives us a kind of intellectual realization that, well, maybe some of this spiritual stuff like prayer or whatever, maybe there's something really going for it. It's kind of somewhat abstract and intellectual. But so to supplement this, I want to look at some other psi phenomena that are more in the maybe category, in the sense that there haven't been hundreds of experiments done on each of these things, but if they are what they seem to be, they have really important implications. One of these is out-of-the-body experiences, which has always been an interest of mine. I originally wrote about out-of-the-body experiences, and being a scientist, I knew that part of appearing scientific is giving things a sexy abbreviation, so I called them OOBEs for out-of-the-body experiences. This was actually my first experience in creating terrible semantic karma, because people for years have been telling me about their oobies. Fortunately, it's been shortened to OBEs by an editor who says you don't capitalize the of, and I don't have quite as much bad semantic karma on that anymore. An out-of-the-body experience I define as having an experience in which you experience yourself as being someplace other than where you intellectually know your physical body is, and the and part is important, you feel your mind is clear at the time. Okay, otherwise you'd count dreams or fever deliriums or what have you. I mean, a typical reaction in an out-of-the-body experience is for the person to say, this is impossible. I happen to know I'm lying in bed, I can't possibly be here in the backyard. Trouble is, their mind feels perfectly normal and they see themselves as in the backyard. Give you an example from my case collection. About 2 p.m. on a lazy afternoon, I saw my husband off to work and went into the bedroom to relax. I was alone in the house and expected to be alone until he returned late that night. I laid down on the couch in the bedroom, throwing a white cover over my legs. I lay listening to the sounds of my neighbors on the patio next door, but they were muted sounds and seemed far away. Suddenly, I was aware of floating about 2 feet from the ceiling in a cross-legged position. I looked down at my body lying on the couch, noting my closed eyes and regular breathing. I was astounded. I floated over to the window and through the closed blind, looked out at my neighbors. June C. was sitting in a chair. Her mother, Mrs. B., was reclining on a chaise lounge, and Pammy C. was nearby playing on the grass. June arose from the chair, poured something from a pitcher into 2 glasses, handed 1 glass to her mother, and called Pammy and gave her a soda pop in a bottle. Then she resumed her chair. I floated back above the couch and again looked at me. Suddenly I was overcome with fright. You know, people suddenly think, what am I doing here? And with this thought, I was again in my body. I jumped from the couch, hurried to the window, and the scene was exactly as I had seen it. Now, in my role as a parapsychologist, I'm not too impressed with the paranormality of this. You know, she could have kind of constructed from the sounds what was likely to be happening there. But I deliberately chose a not very impressive case, because the point I want to make is that for people who have an out-of-the-body experience, they're not impressed by my doubts. Okay? A typical reaction to a person having an out-of-the-body experience is to say something like that, I no longer believe that after I die I'm going to survive. I know I'm going to survive. It's not a belief. It's not an abstraction. I've had the experience of being alive in consciousness without a physical body. So this is a major shift in people's belief experiences, whether it's evidential from a parapsychological point of view or not. Now, mostly what we know about out-of-the-body experiences from spontaneous cases. But if I could have the next slide, my very first parapsychological experiment was on attempting to induce out-of-the-body experiences by hypnosis. This is the first page of it, retyped actually because the old mimeographed copy had faded considerably. This was my report to the Parapsychology Foundation. So you know who corrupted me when I was young and sent me down this path. And when I look back at that experiment, it was poorly designed in the sense that I had no objective way to evaluate it. I was sort of assuming I'd get a really fantastic result and the results would be obvious. On the other hand, when I think, that wasn't too bad for a college sophomore's first try. So But let me tell you about a much more interesting out-of-the-body experiment. If I could have the next slide, please. Years ago, it turns out our babysitter had out-of-the-body experiences. When she discovered that my wife and I were safe to talk to about unusual experiences, she started talking about the fact that ever since she was a kid, she would frequently wake up in the middle of the night and find herself floating near the ceiling and seeing her body lying in bed. And usually that was all there was to it, and it was actually kind of boring. You know, after the first 100 times you've watched yourself sleeping, it's not very exciting. And she thought that was a normal part of sleep. You know, you laid down, you went to sleep, you dreamed a while, you floated near the ceiling, you went to sleep, you woke up and went to school. Well, wasn't that the way it was for everybody? When she'd mentioned it to people once or twice in high school, she learned very quickly to keep her mouth shut. So she asked me, you know, what's really happening? You know, you're the psychologist, explain this to me. So I told her basically there were two theories about it. One was, it was what it seemed to be. There was some real sense in which your mind was up near the ceiling. And the other one was that, no, of course, that's a silly idea. It's some special vivid type of dream where you feel like you're awake, because remember, that's part of the defining characteristic. Your mind feels clear like you're awake. It doesn't feel dreamlike or floaty or something like that. And you're just imagining it. So she said, well, how can I tell? So I told her, okay, write the numbers 1 to 10 on 10 slips of paper, put them in a box face down. After you get in bed, scramble them up and lay one out face up on the bedside table without looking at it. And if you happen to float near the ceiling that night, look at the number and memorize it and check it out the next morning. I saw her a few weeks later, and she said, yeah, she'd done that 7 or 8 times, and she was always right about the number in the morning. Was there anything else interesting we could do? I'm always tempted to say no at this point. And there almost was nothing else. I deliberately chose a not very impressive case, because the point I want to make is that for people who have an out-of-the-body experience, they're not impressed by my doubts. Okay? A typical reaction to a person having an out-of-the-body experience is to say something like that, I no longer believe that after I die I'm going to survive. I know I'm going to survive. It's not a belief. It's not an abstraction. I've had the experience of being alive in consciousness without a physical body. So this is a major shift in people's belief experiences, whether it's evidential from a parapsychological point of view or not. Now, mostly what we know about out-of-the-body experiences from spontaneous cases. But if I could have the next slide, my very first parapsychological experiment was on attempting to induce out-of-the-body experiences by hypnosis. This is the first page of it, retyped actually because the old mimeographed copy had faded considerably. This was my report to the Parapsychology Foundation. So you know who corrupted me when I was young and sent me down this path. And when I look back at that experiment, it was poorly designed in the sense that I had no objective way to evaluate it. I was sort of assuming I'd get a really fantastic result and the results would be obvious. On the other hand, when I think, that wasn't too bad for a college sophomore's first try. But let me tell you about a much more interesting out-of-the-body experiment. If I could have the next slide, please. Years ago, it turns out our babysitter had out-of-the-body experiences. When she discovered that my wife and I were safe to talk to about unusual experiences, she started talking about the fact that ever since she was a kid, she would frequently wake up in the middle of the night and find herself floating near the ceiling and seeing her body lying in bed. And usually that was all there was to it, and it was actually kind of boring. You know, after the first 100 times you've watched yourself sleeping, it's not very exciting. And she thought that was a normal part of sleep. You know, you laid down, you went to sleep, you dreamed a while, you floated near the ceiling, you went to sleep, you woke up and went to school. Well, wasn't that the way it was for everybody? When she'd mentioned it to people once or twice in high school, she learned very quickly to keep her mouth shut. So she asked me, you know, what's really happening? You know, you're the psychologist, explain this to me. So I told her basically there were two theories about it. One was, it was what it seemed to be. There was some real sense in which your mind was up near the ceiling. And the other one was that, no, of course, that's a silly idea. It's some special vivid type of dream where you feel like you're awake, because remember, that's part of the defining characteristic. Your mind feels clear like you're awake. It doesn't feel dreamlike or floaty or something like that. And you're just imagining it. So she said, well, how can I tell? So I told her, okay, write the numbers 1 to 10 on 10 slips of paper, put them in a box face down. After you get in bed, scramble them up and lay one out face up on the bedside table without looking at it. And if you happen to float near the ceiling that night, look at the number and memorize it and check it out the next morning. I saw her a few weeks later, and she said, yeah, she'd done that 7 or 8 times, and she was always right about the number in the morning. Was there anything else interesting we could do? I'm always tempted to say no at this point. And there almost was nothing else we could do because she was moving from the area very shortly after that. But before she left, I managed to have her spend several nights in my sleep laboratory where she would go to bed with electrodes pasted to her scalp to measure her brain waves. I knew about near-death experiences, so I wondered, is her heart slowing? Is her brain activity dropping out? What's going on here? And I'd done sleep research for many years, so I knew the technology, so I wanted to know what was happening psychophysiologically if she had this experience. Also, after she was in bed, I would go off to another room and randomly generate a 5-digit number and write it on a sheet of paper and lay it face up on a shelf up near the ceiling, such that even walking in the room you couldn't see it, and she couldn't get up because that would pull the electrodes off her head, which would throw ink all over the recording room, a very noticeable kind of event. So, being naive enough to ask for a miracle, I basically said, try to have out-of-the-body experiences while you sleep through the night, and if you happen to leave your body, please memorize the number, and also look at the clock here and get the exact time that you're up there so I can get as precise a correlation as possible for what's going on here. Well, she was able to spend several nights in the lab before she moved. She had several out-of-the-body experiences. On all but one of them, she said that unfortunately she was in the wrong part of the room. She was over in the corners, and she had no idea what the number was. She wasn't in a position to see it. Her physiology was very interesting, however. She was not having some kind of clinical crisis, okay? Nobody would call a doctor and say she was near death or something like that. Her brain, she'd wake up right after these and tell me so I could get a pretty good idea. Her brain waves, which are actually shown in the next slide for those of you who want a glimpse at the technicalities, but I'm not going to take the time to explain them, looked somewhat like the pattern associated with dreaming, but not identical to it. They had a lot of extra alpha waves, slowed alpha waves in there that you don't normally see in a sleeping, dreaming EEG pattern. So I was very happy with that. Here was an unusual experience accompanied by an unusual brainwave pattern. I took it to another researcher who was probably the number 1 or number 2 sleep researcher in the world, and we had 100% agreement. He too said, yeah, looks weird to me. I never saw anything like that. The one time she said she was in position to see the number, she correctly told me that the number was 25132. That made me quite excited. Now, generally when I've described this experiment, someone invariably asks the question, did you know the number? And when I admit that I did, they say, well, maybe it was just telepathy. I'm sorry, the first experiment in the world like this, and I forgot to control for mere telepathy. Oh, dear. And other people say, but this doesn't prove anything. And I've tried for years to tell people I didn't do this to prove something other than that you could take as exotic an experience as someone leaving their body and start to bring it into the laboratory and learn something about it. The goal of this experiment was to get hundreds of people going out and finding people who could leave their bodies at will and studying this. Unfortunately, it hasn't worked that way. But anyway, people have out-of-the-body experiences, and it tremendously changes their belief. Now, you've heard more about near-death experiences, which for our purposes I'll define as an out-of-the-body experience plus an altered state of consciousness. That is, in a near-death experience, the person does not usually say, my mind was functioning just like ordinary. They talk about new kinds of knowledge, kind of like the Buck selection I read you and so forth. And this, again, has very impressive effects on people. Not only do they feel they're going to survive death as a deep kind of knowledge, but they get insights into how you're supposed to live life. The most common lesson people come back with is if you haven't learned how to love, you're failing the course. You're going to have to take it over again. 8 to 10 million people have had near-death experiences in this country, which is really interesting because in the Eleusinian Mysteries in classical Greece, they tried to induce near-death experiences to the most prominent people in the culture to give them some direct spiritual experience, and we're doing it through medical technology. And I don't think an operating table is the necessarily best set and setting for a trip like that, but... And I should also say, well, of course, scientific materialism dismisses this all as some kind of hallucination, and they make up imaginary chemicals that have never actually been measured, but which they think accounts for it, or another kind of drug. But there's something interesting going on there. I will also say, incidentally, for you spiritual seekers in the audience, that I don't recommend this as a way of having a deep spiritual experience, because the near part is very tricky. Most people who come that near don't tell us an interesting experience, they get buried. Okay, now one more bit of data, and perhaps one of the most important parts, death. We have some scientific evidence that we may survive death. Can I have the next slide, please, Carlos? Now, at this stage of our cultural history, we have very weird attitudes about it and tend to dismiss it. Here's an old cartoon of your stereotype medium talking to an old lady saying, "Bootsy, Bootsy, we are calling you from the world of the living. Give us a sign, Bootsy." So we tend to ridicule mediumship, but really there's a very serious subject matter there. Don't take this personally, Lizette, okay? Modern spiritualism came about in 1847 in Hydesville, New York, when mysterious rappings seemed to come out of the walls and ceilings and the like at a house in Hydesville, New York. And the next slide shows you the three sisters that were associated with that, the Fox sisters, Margaretta, Leah, and Kate. And pretty soon they started asking questions, you know, if you're there, rap 3 times, and asking questions, and the raps claimed to be being produced by spirits, and the whole phenomenon of spiritualism got started in a big way, spread all over the world. Some of our great-grandparents sat around in seances all the time, wild sorts of times. Now, the thing I always liked about spiritualism is that its basic attitude was a scientific attitude. It said, right, the scientists are right when they say religious beliefs are full of all sorts of weird and wrong ideas, and it's stupid for intelligent people just to believe something because somebody says you better believe this. We don't ask you to believe anything in spiritualism. We ask you to come to mediums who can act as a channel to spirits on the other side, ask them for the spirit of a deceased person you know, and test them by means of questions to see if they know the things that would prove their identity. It's basically a scientific attitude. It said, go out, get your own data before you come to any kind of conclusions. Don't simply believe it, test it. Very sensible attitude. More sensible than the modern stuff. I mean, we had a big channeling phase of about 10 years ago. Channels have a much easier job than mediums did, because the mediums kept trying to produce spirits that could prove they were Uncle Joe. Okay, the channels, you know, when you were talking to Buron from Sirius 5, who had never been around anyway, you either liked what he said or you didn't like what he said, but they didn't have that specificity. A lot of mediumistic communications were not particularly evidential to prove anything. In fact, a lot of them were pretty trite. They were vague generalities about, yes, I'm happy now, please live a good life and you'll be happy too. Reasonable advice, but not proving much. I must say, though, that I stopped taking that criticism that most mediumistic communications were trivial so seriously when I got a Citizens Band radio years ago and found out what the average person does when they get the power to communicate over vast distances. They talk trivia all the time. But some of the better mediumistic communications could get quite specific in providing evidence that this was indeed your deceased loved one over there. The example I'm going to use, since it's the 50th anniversary, is from Eileen Garrett, who was one of the best mediums around ever. Could I have the next slide, please, Carlos? This is a picture I found on the web by simply going to Google and saying, picture Eileen Garrett. It's not from your site. I don't know where it came from, but it came out, what she looked about in her 30s at that time, something like this. This was around the time this happened, okay? She was well known as a medium who was also very skeptical about mediumship. This stuff had happened to her, and she varied tremendously in her attitude toward it. I mean, one of her most famous quotes is that when asked what, after many years of being a medium, what she thought about it, she said something like, well, on Monday, Wednesdays, and Fridays, I believe it is the spirits coming through me, and on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, I think the psychologists are right, my unconscious is making it all up. On Sundays, I try not to think about it. Very sensible woman. Back in the 30s, the glamour science of that time was aeronautics, and it was dirigibles. And in England, if I could have the next slide, please, the R-101, probably the biggest airship ever built at the time, was going to come out of its hangar, and it was going to link the British Empire. You'd be able to fly from England to India in 6 days. I mean, this had the kind of coverage and glamour and romance that our first space shuttle flights had. People were not at all convinced that airplanes were ever going to be anything more than toys. They didn't go very far, they were uncomfortable, but these big, comfortable airships, this was going to be the wave of the future. The R-101 was tremendous news. This is a shot of it moored. The next slide shows you it flying over London on one of its few flights, unfortunately, because the R-101 left the Cardington Aerodrome at 7:36 in the evening on October 4th, 1930, bound for India. It should not have left. It was politics. One prominent government minister was scheduled to be at a conference in India and was going to show Britain's glory in the airship industry. The ship had not been tested very well. At 2:05 in the morning that morning, it crashed into a hill in France and exploded. Next slide is a shot of the wreckage on that. Now, 3 days after that, Eileen Garrett had been asked to hold a seance, this is something that had been arranged many months in advance by an Australian journalist who wasn't really interested in spiritualism but had been assigned to write an article about it. And Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, had died several months before that. So he thought that's a lot of interest because Holmes was interested in spiritualism. Conan Doyle was interested in spiritualism. Conan Doyle was probably the most popular author in the world at that time. His Sherlock Holmes stories were so appreciated. So he thought 3 months after Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's death, I'll go to a medium and try to contact him. His identity was not revealed to Eileen Garrett. That was the standard way. A sitter was brought in and not introduced. Eileen Garrett would go into trance and see what would happen. But the journalist's intention was to try to contact Arthur Conan Doyle. Well, she was in trance a few minutes, and suddenly she became very agitated. Her tears rolled down her cheeks, her hands clenched up, and the voice of her control, a spirit, or ostensible spirit, if you want to be cautious, claimed to be an Easterner named Giovanni. He started hurrying, became agitated, and he said, I see IRVING, or IRVIN. Well, the captain of the R-101 dirigible was Flight Lieutenant Irwin. Okay? Now, Ivani's voice went on saying, he says he must do something about it, apologizes for interfering. For heaven's sake, give this to them. The whole bulk of the dirigible was too much for her engine capacity. Engines too heavy. Gross lift computed badly. And this idea of new elevators, totally mad. The elevator jammed. Oil pipe plug. And then went on to give a lot more technical details. And said, and the dirigible almost scraped the roofs at Achy, A-C-H-Y, it's French, I have no idea how it's properly pronounced. Achy, almost scraped the roofs at Achy. There were some other seances later on, and more technical details came through. Like one of the struts in the nose collapsed and caused a tear in the cover. It's the same strut that caused the trouble before, and the Air Ministry knew about it. The wind was blowing hard, it was raining, and so lots of technical details. When asked a question as to what caused the explosion, the communicator that was supposed to be Irwin said the diesel engine had been backfiring because the oil feed was not right. You see, the pressure in some of the gas bags was accentuated by the undergirders crumpling up. The extra pressure pushed the gas out, and at that moment the engine backfired and ignited the gas. This was hydrogen gas. Lots more technical details. 48 lives were lost. What makes this especially interesting is Lizette Coley, her granddaughter, tells me that Mrs. Garrett was not a technical person. She had difficulty operating a TV set. right? She was not an expert on diesel engines and oil feed lines and whatnot. In fact, when this stuff was eventually published years later, 2 officers from Royal Air Force Intelligence dropped around her apartment one night, were very vague for a long time, and then basically came out and said, with some of the technical details that came out, which were secret, was she sleeping with one of the officers on the dirigible? She threw them out. But that's how good her technical information was. Fascinating book by a guy named Fuller called The Airman Who Would Not Die. It's about some other plane crashes too. It's out of print now, but you can get used copies through Amazon.com. One other thing on survival, reincarnation. It's too complex. You can't give a simple short case of reincarnation. And even with the lure of birthday cake, I don't want to keep you sitting here too long. But basically, Ian Stevenson down at the University of Virginia now has several thousand cases of kids who suddenly start talking about previous lives. They're usually preschool kids who will do something for family harmony, like suddenly saying, I want to go see my wife in my real home, not hang around this dump. In my life where I'm proud to call myself both a scientist and a spiritual seeker. I do the science part well. I can hold my head up high on that. The spiritual side, I work at it. I'm not going to say too much about accomplishments, though. But you can be a rational person, accept real science, not scientism with its a priori dismissal, still be interested in the spiritual, because our best kind of science says there's something really interesting and important going on there. And with that, I think I'll stop, and I'll take questions for those who want to go into more detail on this sort of thing. And am I supposed to stop for a minute while the tape is changed? No? Okay, so we can go
Full speed ahead.
full speed ahead. Yes.
I'm Martin Ebon, and I admire your work.
Oh,
I'm in favor of happiness, and I settle for
Good.
contentment. And I read an article by Charles Tart in the International Journal of Parapsychology, in which he came out in favor of state-specific mind on the part of scholars. And I was wondering, what is state-specific? And I put my mind into a decoding state of mind. And I understood from it that you feel that scientists should, at least from time to time, put themselves into what I might call a biochemical condition. Would you care to be more specific or state-specific on this point?
sure. I didn't say they should necessarily alter their consciousness biochemically. Okay, that's just one way. What I'm saying is that here we are in our ordinary state of consciousness, or at least I assume you're all in an ordinary state of consciousness. You're allowed to walk around loose, so that's our rough definition of normal. And it's a reasonably good state for getting along in the everyday world. But there are altered states of consciousness where the mind functions in a quite different pattern. So, for instance, when I lecture on dreams, I often ask people, after talking about, you can dream about ordinary life situations, and would anybody like to argue with me that perhaps they're dreaming right now? And I always get a philosophical type who wants to, this could be a dream right now. I've dreamed of going to lectures. But before the philosophy gets too deep, I always say, you want to bet me $50 you wake up at home in bed in 5 minutes? Nobody's ever taken me up on my bet. Because when you look at the quality of your consciousness, the quality of dream consciousness is not the same as the quality of the waking state. Hypnosis, various meditative states, certain drug-induced states, the mind works in a different pattern. Now, our bias is to say, well, ordinary consciousness is the only rational state there is, and all those other things are aberrations and pathologies. I don't think it's that simple. Other kinds of states of consciousness can make you more creative, can give you different understandings of things, but you can have false ideas in them as well as true ideas. So you could practice an essential science of observing, refining your ideas and so forth in various altered states of consciousness as well as this one. I think eventually that's going to have to be the way we make sense of parapsychological data. Which seem very paradoxical in a lot of ways in our ordinary state of consciousness. And I suspect that someday people will, some kind of meditative state, where parapsychological stuff will make obvious sort of sense and we'll know how to work it better. That's my guess. Short answer to a potentially very complex question. Nice seeing you after all these years. Yes.
Hi. I would like to know, in your experience in parapsychology, have you found information about brain aberrations producing psychic phenomena? Like I was reading an Oliver Sacks book where he said certain autistics could really be great at calculating and would see numbers. How would that relate to parapsychology?
Well, it will be interesting. Did you hear the question in the back, whether brain aberrations can produce psi phenomena? It'd be interesting to reverse the question. Why aren't we all psychic all the time? I mean, what's wrong with our brains that we can't exercise telepathy and clairvoyance and that stuff all the time? Well, part of the answer has to be that for ordinary purposes, our 5 senses are exquisitely good for telling us exactly what we need to know about what's in our immediate vicinity, and normally what's in your immediate vicinity is all that's really relevant. So we don't need psychic stuff for the vast majority of things. So it's great that our ordinary senses work. But we go further than that, and we train people not to be psychic. If you want to read some horror stories, read some of the biographies of people who were very psychic when they were kids, and the horrible ways they were treated. Because we don't consider that normal. They must be crazy or possessed by the devil or something like that. We have very strong social conditioning to not be psychic, and we have fears about psychic abilities. Now, if someone suffers a brain injury, even if their brain doesn't actually get injured, but they think they have, right? They got hit in the head really hard, there's a very real sense in which they now have a marvelous social excuse to act different. I can't help what I say or what I experience because my brain is different. It may be that specific brain injuries actually free up psychic abilities, or let's say interfere with the inhibitions in fairly specific ways, but there's also this general factor that you've got a socially acceptable excuse. Now again, I don't recommend the method. I used to know Peter Herkos, who was a very interesting psychic, claimed he became psychic after he fell off a ladder 3 stories, landed on his head, woke up in a hospital, turned to the stranger in the next bed and said, "Why did you sell the watch your father gave you on his deathbed?" Great story. I don't know whether it's true or not. But yeah, again, it's not a method I recommend because it's hard to land just right after that 3-story fall. There may be brain regions that are selectively involved in parapsychological things in terms of helping them, but I think the actual sign mechanism itself is about this quality of mind that's something different from the brain. Best guess,
I'd
yeah.
like to ask you, with reference to a traditional scenes room phenomenon like the dancing table, I'm sure you've heard of that. Would you say that is due to psychological automatism, or are the sitters conduits for the spirits?
Yeah, table movement was very common at seances practically from the very beginning. But of course, people who are intelligently skeptical have always said, well, when you got your hands on something, you're not just resting them there, you can exert sideways forces, and we also know you can do these things unconsciously, so the table may move because people are not really in touch with their unconscious minds. And I'm sure some of the table movement that happens is due to that. But of course, then there's some other very interesting observations where tables keep moving when nobody's touching it anymore. And we don't know what to do with those. In fact, they've almost become taboo. For example, one of the great physical mediums of the 19th century was a man named D.D. Home. And D.D. Home, working in the light, the rooms were not completely dark. There was usually candles lit or a lantern going. Often people would sit around a big, heavy dining room table, which would begin to move around or rise up. But quite a few times, everybody then left the table. And while everybody's standing back in the corner of the room, this 500-pound oak dining room table is seen to be floating in the air. Now, our modern minds say, oh, that was a long time ago, and people were so ignorant. They couldn't possibly have seen what they said they saw. I can't dismiss that quite so easily. We don't have anybody around like that today, unfortunately. It'd be real interesting to have. If I published results on that sort of thing, my colleagues would probably crucify me if I saw it, but honesty would compel me to do it. So, yeah, a lot of it is automatic motor movements, but I don't think that accounts for all of it. Yeah.
Yes, I know somebody. The table is a friend of mine, and it's very interesting. And the table is very heavy. She's here in America, and it's quite interesting.
It's fascinating.
She is a psychologist, by the way.
Oh, it even happens to psychologists? Goodness gracious. Yeah, yeah.
Very, very good friends for many years,
Yeah.
and it's just very amazing.
Yeah. You know, there are fashions in research.
And she can stop touching. We do it together.
We have real fashions in research, and sometimes something that's researched very heavily for a while gets a bad reputation, and what was good about it is forgotten, and it's all lumped into the bad category, and nobody will have anything more to do with it. Spoon bending is a good example, right? When Uri Geller was around, and nobody could still figure out whether he helped parapsychology or hurt it or how much of either, but he certainly caused a lot of commotion. He got some people very interested in metal bending, and it turns out there's a lot of ways you can do metal bending by trickery. And there were also a few experiments in which it was very hard to see how any trickery could be involved, but you still got some bending. But the whole area got such a bad flavor that everybody backed away from it. You know, it's too controversial. That's not the way research should be done. You know, we should go where the phenomena lead us, but, you know, real human beings worry about their reputation and their job and things like that. Well, yeah.
I'm curious about your opinions on telepsychics and asking not being afraid to ask your own brain questions, in semi-meditative states, for instance, before bed. I remember the scientists from India Bose did some experiments on stuff like that. And I just wanted to know what your take was on that.
Well, my general take on telepsychics or any kind of stage performances, I take it as entertainment. Simply because, there's good money to be made in fooling people about psychic stuff. And the art of good magic is to make you think you understand all the conditions and they're under control, when in point of fact they're not. So parapsychologists don't, take any of that stuff seriously that they see on that. And also there are many ways to fake this, okay? Part of a good parapsychological education is to know how to do fake psychic readings. So for instance, I'm going to give you a psychic reading. You're a very intelligent person, right? But you haven't lived up to your full potential. And I see difficulties with someone of the opposite sex, and although you think you've pretty much gotten over it, there's still some hurt inside. It's easy to do this sort of thing, but fortunately we have laboratory methods to get things a little more accurate than that, Now, I know some people who go to psychics for personal advice, and some of the people who do this, I think, are basically stupid. I mean, they're giving their own authority away to someone of dubious credentials. Some of the other people who do this, I think, are being very intelligent. They're getting an outside and unusual input on problems they have, and that may inspire them to a creative solution. And sometimes the psychics they go to actually function in a psychic manner and produce some information that's genuinely useful. So in real life, it's very complicated. But, what you see on television, enjoy the entertainment. I certainly do. I love magic shows. My eyes bulge, my mouth goes, duh, how did you do that? Yeah.
Particular, like in terms of telepathy, is there a specific concentration of telepathic incidences around death and very heavy emotional incidences where people communicate to others?
That's the impression you get from looking at what happens in everyday life, yeah. The death of a loved one or a bad accident to a loved one is very likely to bring out some kind of telepathic communication. Louisa Ryan collected, 100,000 cases? Many, many cases, and lots of them were of this sort. Yeah. And of course, it makes psychological sense that at some level we're concerned about the people we love more than we're concerned about strangers. Although I have heard someone argue that maybe we have a lot of telepathic flashes that are totally trivial with people we don't know. We don't recognize them as anything. There might be some of that too. If you suddenly share one thought with somebody who's walking by on the street downstairs. But it certainly makes more sense to think that the emotional link does it. And there's some experimental data that people who have a strong emotional link with each other will do better in formal laboratory tests and the like. Certainly in the remote viewing studies, which have been some of the most successful things around, they usually tried to get some kind of link between the people involved rather than just having this be strangers. You can get psychic functioning with total strangers, but it looks like a link is usually a good idea. Yeah.
You haven't mentioned past life regressions by competent hypnotists. What's your view on that?
There are many things I haven't mentioned, and that's certainly one of them, past life regressions. How many of you remember The Search for Bridie Murphy? Fantastic book. I came across it while I was a college student. It was on the remainder table for $1 because it hadn't become a bestseller yet. And I normally didn't read anything but scientific books and science fiction at the time. But I happened to glance at this one and saw it had hypnosis in the title, so I picked it up and read it. And I thought, this is a very interesting case of hypnotic regression to a past life. I knew a lot about hypnosis then, and the author of the book clearly knew a good deal about it. And a lot of the material he collected from his regressed subject was evidential. Some of it didn't match, but nobody expects someone's memory to be perfect. Then I started reading the reviews about it. The main thing I discovered at that point was in the 1950s, if you said the word reincarnation, you could induce apoplexy in all sorts of scientists and ministers and so forth. Our culture was not ready for reincarnation. They wrote reviews of this Bridie Murphy book that were so off that I kept thinking, maybe there were two books called The Search for Bridie Murphy, published by somebody named Maury Burns, and this other one was full of all these terrible statements and claims. People that I knew as scientific authorities in hypnosis made asses of themselves. I mean, if you're going to criticize someone, you should at least know what they actually said instead of just spouting off. Now, but to answer that in a more serious way, the problem with hypnotic regressions is what has a lot of problems. For one thing, hypnosis does not necessarily get you truth. It can get you fantasies that appear to be truth to the person being regressed. I did hypnosis research for many years, so you can get a lot of stuff that probably is not literally true. Second, a deeply hypnotized subject is very cooperative, wants to please the hypnotist, so their unconscious mind can create all this material. They're not consciously faking, but it's a dramatization, greatly helped by the fact that in this day and age, we've all read so many historical novels and seen so many TV documentaries that our unconscious minds are chock full of information about past eras, especially over the last 100 years or so. So generally, I'm more impressed by the spontaneous cases where these kids remember something. I don't rule out hypnotic regression, nor do I rule it out as a therapeutic technique. There are a lot of therapists who found that when they're stuck on trying to find causes of problems in this life, a hypnotic regression produces an apparent memory from a past life, and whether it's true or whether it's a fantasy, the person then gets better. They feel like they've worked it out. So there's definitely a therapeutic use there. But it's a tricky method. I never got involved experimentally in it because I knew it would be an enormous amount of work, and there were other things I wanted to study too. So, a mixed blessing. That book is still an excellent reincarnation case if you want to reread it. I'm sure it's out of print now, but it's really quite good. The Search for Bridie Murphy by Maury Bernstein. Yeah.
So, ideally, what do you feel has been the goal of your research? Like, what direction? 50 years from now, if what you've worked has, or what you've done has become successful, where do you see the field going? Do you see ways for people to increase psychic ability or awareness or whatever? And are there any methods that have been particularly successful in doing that you've noticed?
My goal, and the goal certainly of some of the other people in the field, is to build bridges between the scientific world and the spiritual world. Not between the scientific world and the dogmatic religious world, okay? I mean, there are people in all walks of life who have dogmatic opinions who aren't interested in anything else, and there's nothing you can do about people like that. But people who are genuinely scientifically open and people who are genuinely spiritually open and want to learn the truth about spiritual things rather than impose their particular brand on it, I want to build bridges between these people because I think they can help each other. For instance, this is not specifically parapsychological, but it comes close. A friend of mine is a very good meditation teacher. And we were talking about trying to learn the kind of classical Buddhist meditation that he teaches people. And he says, it's been my experience, and that of lots of other Western Buddhist teachers that I know, that if you do a weekend workshop or a retreat or something like that and teach some meditation, you have 100 people there, practically all of them are going to say they learned something, it's important, this has touched them, this is going to be a part of their life. They've learned something that they can really grow with. If you go back a year later and 5 of those are still practicing meditation, you're doing well. And he says, in the East, in the traditional meditation teachings, the teachers, they don't worry about this, If it's your karma to come around and learn meditation, you'll come around. If it's your karma to drop out, you'll drop out. If it's your karma to come back 10 lifetimes later, you'll come back. Que sera, sera. But, he and I got very agitated. He said, we're Westerners. If I started a university and I had a 95% dropout rate, I would really question my teaching methods. That's pretty high. How can you teach this stuff more effectively? Okay, well, first off, you have to think something real is going on and worthwhile to do it. But open-minded science could, for instance, try to find out what kind of meditation training techniques work for what kind of person. So instead of Guru so-and-so teaches you this way because that's the way he was taught and that's the way he was taught, things are adapted to an individual person. I think the parapsychological stuff is mainly important at this point for its implications rather than its applications. That is, it'd be nice if we could use applied telepathy sometimes, but gosh, the telephone's so convenient. It's not a terribly pressing need most of the time. But the implications that spirituality may be real, that it's worthwhile to try to find meaning in our life by developing in a spiritual sense, that to me is far more important than the potential applications at this point. And that's my goal, to form those bridges so smart scientists will think about spirituality and help learn things about making it more effective. Smart, open spiritual people will help open scientists up to have a bigger worldview than just narrowing everything down and crushing the human spirit. That's the direction that I've been going in, and I think a fair number of my colleagues in parapsychology, and not all, some of them say their interest is primarily technical. They're just really fascinated by this funny data and want to work with the numbers some more. But it's a big world, there's room for all of us. We getting close to birthday cake time?
I think so, Charlie.
I kept people sitting for a long time.
Yes.
Thank you.
Don't go running away.
Don't go running away?
Don't go running away.
Can I go to my seat?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we have all shown our appreciation to Dr. Tart for a fascinating lecture. He's obviously been busy in all his career building bridges, and I would welcome you all to the Eileen Garrett Library of Parapsychology Foundation of over 10,000 volumes, because certainly the issues that he's raised tonight are very tantalizing, and for further information, please use the resource. And now, as an end to our 50th anniversary celebrations, there will be anniversary cake and celebratory beverage. It's just fizzy apple juice or whatever, non-alcoholic, because we want you all to get safe home. But please join us, and thank you very much for attending.
Thank you.